But what I really want to talk about is the impact of the railway, mainly on this part of Cambridge. But I'm actually starting before the railways. This is a map of Cambridge in 1830. It's one of a series of maps of university and other towns done by a cartographer called Moore. And as far as I can see, it is pretty accurate. And I think the one thing that will immediately strike you looking at the map is the contrast between the western side and the eastern side. On the eastern side, all over here, you've got land that until around about 1810 was entirely open countryside. This is what had been the Barnwell or East Field of Cambridge, and one of the open fields, there was a similar West Field, which, because they were subject to common rights, couldn't actually be built on until they were enclosed. And there was an Enclosure Act in 1806 which divided up this big open area into small individual holdings that speculative builders, colleges and other people started to develop from around about 1812, 1815 onwards. And as you can see, it's all very, very patchy. It's not sort of growing out, as you might imagine, from the town centre. It's very, very hit and miss, mainly along Newmarket Road there, some development down East Road here, but virtually nothing on Mill Road. There is Mill Road, there is East Road, so you've got the corner here. There's the mill that gives Mill Road its name. There's the rather mysterious, rather short-lived Barnwell New Church, the original cricket ground, which was eventually moved over the road to Fenners, and that's about it. And there's a big contrast, obviously, over here. This is effectively medieval Cambridge. Cambridge as it existed from before the time of the Norman Conquest down to the early 19th century. Grossly overcrowded. I think you can probably see to some extent the dense pattern of residential development in areas like Bridge Street, etc., and entirely dependent for things that it produced itself and for things coming in, particularly things like coal, entirely dependent on the river. And down to the mid-Middle Ages, and all this area along here, what is now the Backs, had really been the commercial heart of Cambridge. There'd been a whole series of merchants' houses, warehouses, quays, hives as they were called, lanes running down to the river. In other words, it had been very much like, should we say, King's Lynn or Wisbech. And gradually, over the course of the Middle Ages, the colleges acquiring this land, and the consequence was that by 1830, commercial activity on the river is really restricted to two areas. Up here, quayside, and down here, the mill pool, where the graduate centre is now. And the next slide, I hope, will take us there. Here we are. This, not sure of the date of this, I suspect it's either just before or just after the First World War, because you will see on this warehouse here, motors are stored, or stabled. It's obviously after 1896 when cars are on the road. And you will also see over here, some of you may remember this, the chimney of the electricity generating station, which was one of the major industries around here. It's all surrounded by warehouses, etc., particularly the bonded warehouse. By the time of this photograph, I think river trade has ceased, not least because of the fact that there's now a fence along here, it's very difficult unloading barges, although there's still a crane remaining there. And so this is the common quay. This is where most goods are handled. Moving upstream, the problem was, for the barge traffic, there is no tow. And the consequence is, and it's shown in a lot of paintings of the period, that barges have to be towed upstream and indeed floated back downstream by horses which are walking along in the middle of the river. There you are, you can see it's just the upper part of the horse exposed here. It's pulling a typical train of Fenland lighters, and there's effectively a raised causeway along the bank of the river that the horses knew very well to walk along. The colleges, Claire here of course, the colleges disliked all this intensely. It was a sort of commercial activity that destroyed the sort of academic calm. And I think they also thought that the undergraduates were picking up language they should not know from the bargees as they were going past. But not whether that's the case, I do not know. But anyway, eventually you move upstream and you've got the King's and Bishop's mills. Around the mill pool, again some coal handle here as well as grain. It's another very commercial area. Was once again the warehouses intermixed with residential accommodation, but very different to the bottom end of Mill Lane as we know it today. Well, this is all swept away in the middle of the 19th century, the river traffic as the railways appear. And this is what we might call the mature railway network of Cambridge in 1923. You'll notice that there are different colours on the map. The blue is the Great Eastern Railway, which, as you can see, is the dominant company, not just in Cambridge, but in the whole of East Anglia. It's got a virtually complete territorial monopoly. And the spine of all of this is here, the line coming up from London, through Cambridge, and on towards Ely. Opened in 1845, by the Eastern Counties Railway, which became the Great Eastern in 1862. Most of the other lines on the map, the other blue ones, are promoted by local companies. The Eastern Counties was a miserly company, to put it mildly. Didn't like building railways itself. What it waited usually was for local people to build them. And then when they proved to be financially unviable, the Eastern Counties just snapped them up for considerably less than they cost to build. And that way it builds up its empire. It was a company that enjoyed an appalling public reputation. If you look at the Cambridge Chronicle or the Cambridge Independent Press in the 1850s, early 1860s, the editorials and the correspondence columns are full of complaints about the railway, about unpunctuality, the incivility of the railway servants, the dangerous nature of the track and the rolling stock. It just goes on and on. Excursion trains that are about 12 hours late by the time they get back to Cambridge. And in an early example of corporate makeover, the Eastern Counties actually changed its name in 1862 to the Great Eastern. And didn't just change its name, it did actually turn over a new leaf. And although, as we shall see, it was never the most prosperous of railway companies, largely because of its agricultural basis, it did the best it could for the region. And particularly it helped farmers a lot during the Great Agricultural Depression that started in the 1870s. So it dominates the Cambridge railway scene, but there are other players. Most notably, you'll see there's this black line coming in here. That's the London and North Western, which, again, was promoted as a local company, the Cambridge and Bedford, very quickly swallowed up, in this case, by the L&W. And it runs through Bedford to Bletchley, and eventually on to Oxford. And this is a line, of course, that was closed amidst a lot of public dissent in 1967, and the one that may or may not be resurrected sometime in the next 10, 15 years. And suggesting the next 10 or 15 years, it's salutary to remember that every single railway on this map, with the exception of the Mildenhall line, which is the one up there, everything was built in a 20-year period, from 1845 to 1865, which is really an immense achievement when you come to think about it. And the Victorians, for all their faults, were certainly energetic, go-getting, and just got on with the job. So you've got London North Western, and you've got a little bit of Midland there, just a good step. The Midland didn't really get anywhere near Cambridge. The nearest it got was Huntingdon. but it had running powers over the line from Knives, and so was able to bring both goods and passenger trains into Cambridge. And the final player is the Great Northern, this green line down here. Now, for complicated reasons of railway history and politics, the Great Northern didn't actually get into Cambridge. The last 5 or 6 miles of the line through Foxton and Harston were owned by the Great Eastern, but never ever saw a Great Eastern train. Not a curious situation when you come to think of it. Purely Great Northern. And the Great Northern and the Great Eastern competed for the London to Cambridge traffic. And by and large, it was said that townspeople used the Great Eastern to go to Liverpool Street, and university people the Great Northern to go to King's Cross, because King's Cross was nearer the University of London, the British Museum, the West End clubs, etc. Liverpool Street, of course, is nearer all the financial institutions, the docks, so on and so forth. So this is the basic network, and here we have an ordnance survey map around about 1870. And the reason I included this is because it does show the fact that the station is well outside the built-up area. There we are, it's there. I would give you a slight health warning on this. The town may have grown out slightly more than is suggested here. The Ordnance Survey, right through the 19th century, only did very partial revision of the 1-inch maps. And this one was actually surveyed in 1830 or thereabouts. This is an edition from 1870. And what they did by and large was to mark really major changes. So the railways were added in the 1840s and 1850s. But minor changes, like urban growth, are not shown. So by 1870, the town has probably grown out a little further towards the railway, but not all that much. And the other, as it were, caveat to make is that they often didn't take things off the map, that no longer existed. And you've got a classic example of it here in the Newmarket and Chesterford Railway, which actually plays a part in the story of Mill Road. It was another of these independent companies, which was floated very largely by Newmarket racing interests, the jockey clubs that would have been the major people involved. And they were authorised in 1846 to build a railway, well, 2 railways in fact, from Newmarket, first of all to Cambridge, and secondly to Great Chesterford. And remarkably, they decided to build the line to Great Chesterford rather than the one to Cambridge. And this is it, coming down here, more or less parallel to the A11, all the way down, and Chesterford is somewhere off the bottom of the map. Now, not surprisingly, they discovered very quickly they'd made a mistake. That in normal circumstances, hardly anybody wanted to go from Newmarket to Great Chesterford, and very few people wanted to go from Great Chesterford to Newmarket. There's hardly anywhere en route that they served. There was a station down here at Abington, Pampusford as it was called, and there was another station here, very misleadingly, well not misleadingly, honestly called Balsham Road. If anybody had gone to Balsham Road thinking it was anywhere near Balsham, they would have been sadly disappointed to discover they got a 5 or 6 mile walk to get there. Very quickly, financial difficulties. The line was actually closed for about 3 months in 1850. There was a boardroom revolution. New board of directors decided to do what they should have done in the first place and build the line to Cambridge, which they did. Here it is, using one line that they'd salvaged from the double track line down to Great Chesterford. And as soon as this was completed in 1851, the Chesterford line was closed, and the remaining track was ripped up, but it's still, as I suggested, shown here in 1870. as if it still exists. And the connection with Mill Road is, as you can see, the route into Cambridge, if you compare it with the current, or that's there now, is very different. The line now goes up there and curves round, as you can see. The original line runs just to the south of Mill Road and has left its mark in the townscape as it is today. And here, photographed many years ago, in fact I shudder to think how long ago it was this photograph. Got this lovely collection of classic cars in front of the station, and some of you will doubtless remember the old 101 that was the major means of getting to the station from the town centre. A station designed possibly by Sampson Wood, and possibly by another architect called Francis Thompson, and it is very unclear which one of them got the major hand in it. It's situated way out of town, as I said. It's in the open countryside, very largely because of pressure from the university, or pressure from the individual colleges, who, although they recognised the importance of the railway, Cambridge should have a railway, didn't like the idea of the station being actually near the town. Railways, of course, are dirty, they're noisy, they're smelly, and so you want the railway, you keep it at arm's length. And so the station is in the middle, literally, of the open countryside, and the new station road is laid out in 1845, going down to it, and you've got actually quite an imposing station building, which has been messed around a lot over the years. But originally, this archway here, and there's a corresponding one at the other end, gave access to a covered sort of carriageway. So the carriages could drive in, people could get out of them, and get onto the platform without getting wet. And there was a corresponding arch on the other side of the building, hidden by this bit, which was where the trains ran. Single platform, single line, again going through this colonnade. But it was demolished in the 1860s, and if you look carefully at the station, you will see that it is obviously had a bit shaved off on the other side. It's very unfinished looking, but this is where this rail side arcade was. It's a station which was not particularly liked or admired at the time. And once again, the local press was very scathing about it, and the Cambridge Chronicle in particular said it looks fine from a distance, but when you get there, it is simply a miserable erection of brick. And what they thought was that Cambridge should have had a stone-built station, something that looked much more like the colleges, sort of a bit of ashlar and architectural detail and things like that. And nonetheless, it has survived and, of course, gone through umpteen modifications, of which this is the latest, done by Network Rail over the past couple of years or so, and finally producing, I think, an interior of the station that does actually work, and is actually a rather nice piece of architecture. You can appreciate it perhaps for the first time. And particularly, it's worth just pausing, have a look at the ceiling detail. How much of that is original and how much has been restored, nobody seems to quite know. But they have made a good job, but this is where the carriage is once drawn up there, and on the other side is where the platform. But there's not exactly a twist in the tale, but there's more to it than that. Because it was actually two stations in one. There's the 1845 Great Eastern County Station there. This building here, and this range of offices along here, is another station. And this is the Great Northern Station. This is where the King's Cross trains went into platform 3. Now, the Great Northern desperately wanted to get its own line into Cambridge, and tried for about 10 years to get separate access, probably coming in by Haslingfield, Trumpington, that sort of route, and ideally with a terminus in the town centre, possibly the Botanic Gardens, although it was a bit far out, and they'd really got their eye on Christ Pieces as the ideal location. application for a station, which, as you might imagine, didn't go down particularly well with Emmanuel and Christ's and the other colleges around that part of the town. So eventually, the Great Northern gave up, had to continue using Great Eastern, but did build its own station contiguous, as it were, to the Great Eastern. But a completely separate establishment, right down to the First World War. It had its own booking office, luggage offices, buffet, waiting rooms, etc. And as it were, any connection with the establishment next door is purely coincidental in the phrase that they would use. Eventually common sense prevailed and the facilities were amalgamated. Unfortunately, British Rail in the 1970s seemed to have wrecked the building. It eventually became the parcels office. And they put in these big sort of roller shuttered doors there, which thankfully have just been removed over the past few weeks, and it's reverted to looking what it must have looked like when it was built in the 1860s, and it is actually a great improvement. So hats off to Network Rail for doing that. So you've got these two stations, with always, or nearly always, this long single platform that was unique to Cambridge. It wasn't unique to Cambridge in the early days. A lot of stations only had a single platform. Cambridge's was a short one, and the big problem, well not the big problem, a self-imposed problem, was that the timetable of the Eastern Counties Railway always seemed to involve two trains arriving at the same time into Cambridge. And there was a sort of minor craze for betting in the town as to which train would arrive first, which one would actually be allowed onto the platform. In 1851, an island platform was actually built over here, more or less where these wagons are standing, which lasted for about 15 years, and was very unpopular with Cambridge people. The only way you could get to it was by a very steep footbridge, or alternatively a dank, smelly subway that ran under the tracks. And in around about 1863, it was done away with. The platform was extended so it could take two trains at once, and that is the situation as it remained until about 2 or 3 years ago, when the New Island platforms 7 and 8 was put in, and the original platform 1 here, platform 4 down there, with the crucial feature of the whole layout, this central crossover that allowed trains in either direction to use either of the platforms. Right, well, we're getting finally near the view from the bridge, and this is not quite the view from the bridge. This is a view of 1911 taken by an intrepid photographer who's climbed up a signal with his glass plate camera and has managed to take an image of actually superb clarity in the circumstances, looking south towards the station. And it's a view which is not unrecognisable today. Platform 4, platform 5, platform 6 over here, all of it, of course, the locomotive sheds that have been swept away and they're altered beyond recognition on this side. And I think the one thing that this photograph does show is the poverty of the Great Eastern Railway, in the sense that as traffic developed at Cambridge, it never had the money to actually redesign the layout to cater for more trains. It simply had to add bits as and when it could financially, and the result is an immensely complicated layout, which I don't think anybody quite understands how they actually managed to work it, what all these different lines were for. And the one thing that is still there in 1911 is the Newmarket line. And there it is, curving away from platform 4, crossing all these lines on the level, and then going out along the back of the Mill Road. And even at the time, even in the 1850s, this must have been an inconvenience. By the 1880s, and it was becoming a major headache. Every time the train needed to go to Newmarket, everything else had to stop. It just messes the whole thing up. And this was becoming an increasing problem because of the fact that traffic was developing. Now, I said earlier that the Great Eastern was a East Anglian company, which, by and large, wasn't particularly well off. What it desperately wanted was access to the Midlands and the North. And in 1882, it got it, with the line running up here from March through Spalding and Sleaford, eventually Lincoln, and then on to Doncaster, which it built jointly with the Great Northern Railway. And this gave it access to the Nottinghamshire Derbyshire coalfield, to the South Yorkshire coalfield, to the industries of the West Riding and the North Midlands, and in consequence, freight traffic developed very, very rapidly, especially coal coming from Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire down through Cambridge to the industries and the domestic hearths of East London, Dockland, Thameside, etc. This really meant that Cambridge Station was becoming almost impossible to operate because of the density of traffic, and something would have to be done about the Newmarket line. And something was done, although it took quite a long time to do it. But in 1896, the diversion line, as you can see here, was built over Coleman's Common to join the original line down here on the way to Cherry Hinton. There is the original line, still in situ on this map. It was used as a siding until the 1920s, but no longer as a through line. So this was opened in 1896. It had taken about 10 years because the Borough Council, as it then was, didn't want Coleman's Common to be bisected by the railway, raised lots of objections, and eventually the railway company had to buy some more land and give it to a town in recompense for what it had done. And even today, that is the 1896 curve, photographed on the Coleman's Lane Bridge, even today you can still see the influence of the Newmarket line on the landscape south of Mill Road, in the fact that if you go down really any of the streets on the other side of the bridge, Cyprus Road, Malta Road, etc., you walk down typical Victorian or Edwardian terraces, and then you suddenly come to 1920s, 1930s housing. And this is, of course, because these streets stopped at the railway. And it was only when the railway was removed in the 1920s that the town can expand, and so you still get this very sharp divide, as in Marlborough Road, for example, where you've got these houses that would once have looked houses on the railway. It was been running along here, so the houses would actually have been facing the railway. And until relatively recently, you could still trace it. It's becoming more difficult each year, but this is probably more or less where the line crossed Coleridge Road. And down near Brockfields, again, until the 1980s, you could still, with a sort of slight leap of the imagination, see where the railway used to run. And the Scout headquarters are in the background there. This is looking towards Cambridge, although, of course, it has been redeveloped for housing. And this is where the two lines came together, over near Cherry Hinton, the 1896 curve going off to the right. The original 1851 alignment would have gone through the bushes there. And that was as far as it went in the 19th century. And it was only in the 1920s that Cambridge was remodelled yet again. And this reflected the fact that the Great Eastern in 1923 became part of the new LNER, the London North Eastern Railway. And in the 1920s at least, the LNER had got sufficient money to sort out Cambridge once and for all. And it did it with a really major remodelling scheme, which involves segregating passenger and freight traffic. So here we've got the passenger side. This is obviously a photograph taken in the early 70s. Here's the passenger side, carriage sidings in the middle there, and goods lines diverging round here, avoiding the whole of the station complex, then rejoining the main line down at Mill Road Bridge, as we shall see in a moment. It was probably the most advanced signalling system in the country when it was installed in 1926. A very complex layout, and as you can see, all this point work here, double slips, single slips, etc. The sort of thing that would give a modern permanent way engineer nightmares to think of keeping it all in alignment was just part of the package. Very American-looking signals. This is the north end of platform 5. It's an Ipswich train waiting to leave sometime in the late 1950s. But these signals, again, were unique. There weren't any like these anywhere else in the country. And I think reflect the fact that there is a lot of American influence and American technology going into the new system. So this was done in 1926, and it's a good job it was. Because 10, 13 years later, the Second World War put immense pressure on Cambridge's railways. Not just the fact that ordinary goods transport by road is becoming more difficult because of petrol rationing and shortages, etc., but also war material being moved, particularly, for example, construction materials to the various aerodromes being built in East Anglia, bombs, high explosives, etc., being moved, and the consequences, well, not the consequences, but without the rebuilding of 1926, it's very difficult to know how Cambridge would have coped. And what we're looking at here is what is now quite a well-known photograph, or it wasn't when I bought this copy of it. This is Cambridge in 1943. This is the view from Mill Road Bridge in the middle of the Second World War. And as you can see here, we've got a coal train going through, carriages and sidings, J69, all the shunting over there, everything dominated by the coaling plant, which had been put in the 1930s. And when I first came across this photograph, it seemed to me a bit odd, because railways are a major strategic asset in the Second World War. So, two questions. How is somebody able just to take a photograph of the railway without being arrested? And secondly, how on earth have they got access to colour film? Well, the answer is obvious when you think about it. It is an American serviceman. American servicemen, of course, with cameras, colour films, with the liberty to go more or less where they wanted, are able to take lots of the earliest colour photographs of the country that we know. And so here we've got this unique image, and there are many of them, and I just put this one in out of interest. This is Royston Station in 1944, with a Cambridge to King's Cross train coming in, and as you can see, the entire Castor Foyles wall lined along the platform to see it come in. And there are quite a number of other sideways which are well worth having a look at. And the layout of 1926 survived until the remodelling again of 1980-1981. And again, this is a photograph I took from Mill Road Bridge. On a Sunday, these are the goods lines in the foreground. It was a Sunday, there were diversions of the East Coast main line, so you've got Intercity 125 coming through using the goods lines. But it's a scene that hadn't really changed, apart from the motive power from the 1930s, but was all very soon to be swept away, completely remodelled. That's the view as it was, reflecting, above all else perhaps, the change in emphasis in Cambridge railways from freight traffic to passenger traffic. Down to the 1960s, it was freight that was the lifeblood of the railways here. From the 60s onwards, it's increasingly passengers. There are no longer really the need for separate goods lines, still sidings over here for what remained in the freight traffic, but it's the passenger trains which now dominate. And that's the other end of the station post-electrification. Well, round about the station, what about the townscape? The strange thing, not strangely, but one unique thing about Cambridge is that the area around the station doesn't develop in the way that the areas around the stations normally do in other towns of a similar size. where you get commercial development, you get hotels, often rather seedy hotels, you get other establishments of dubious reputation. Not the case in Cambridge. The reason is that the landowner, Jesus College, was determined to maintain an upmarket appearance in this part of Cambridge. And so Station Road, the new road laid out in 1845, from the 1860s onwards, is lined by these very substantial Victorian villas, which were all built on 99-year leases. And this is why Station Road started to be redeveloped from about 1969 onwards, as the leases fell in. So Jesus, as the landowner, is able to gradually clear most of these houses and put up the office blocks that themselves, of course, have been replaced as part of the CB1 development, or many of them have. But luckily, at least a few of the villas survive, but how long is anybody's guess. And of course, outside the station, the area has changed dramatically from what it was 30 or 40 years ago. 30 or 40 years ago, you'd have been looking at really purely railway buildings here. You'd have had the back end of the engine shed over here, workshops, etc. You'd have had the station hotel on the other side, and the inevitable conflict of pedestrians, motor vehicles, buses, taxis, etc. All now finally sorted out. I wouldn't really call it a triumph of town planning, a triumph of architecture, but I suppose it's inoffensive is the best that one can say about it. And it does actually seem to work, and you can actually now walk into the station without risking life and limb as you're coming across there. So a few years ago it was actually quite different. That's the view looking down Station Road. This neo-Georgian building here was a railway building. This was the divisional civil engineer who had his offices there. And behind it, again, many of you will remember, Great Eastern House, which was built by the railway, British Rail, or British Railways as it was then, in 1961, as the headquarters of the Cambridge division of British Railways. Having built the office block, almost immediately the Cambridge division of British Railways was abolished, and all the staff moved to Norwich. And Great Eastern House was really something of a white elephant. The railway still had a presence in there. The Cambridge Control Office was up on the first floor. But it went to a variety of occupants. The South Cambridge District Council were there for some years, the Forestry Commission were there, and of course it was eventually demolished. And now we have, again, the inevitable march of the office blocks, the coffee shops, Microsoft, etc., all of which have changed the landscape out of all recognition. A few years ago I was on the design panel of the City Council. I was representing the Antiquarian Society, and every meeting we had a presentation from the current developer of CB1. It seemed to change very rapidly, and every single developer talks about an iconic gateway to the city. If I got £1 for every time that phrase had been used in meetings, I'd be a rich man today. But whether it's iconic or not, I leave it to you to decide. Very different, though, on the other side of the tracks. Romsey Town. Now, why it is called Romsey Town is mysterious. Even Alan Brickley, who knows everything there is to be known, of course, about Mill Road, he doesn't know why it's Romsey Town. Doesn't seem to be a land area called Romsey or whatever. But whatever the case is, it develops from the 1850s as the railway quarter of Cambridge. A very distinct and physically isolated settlement. Isolated because there was no Mill Road bridge. There was a level crossing. It was hardly ever open to road traffic because of the density of rail traffic. It's self-contained, inward-looking in a sense, very different to the rest of the town. The bridge came in 1889, but the railway character of Romsey doesn't change. In fact, perhaps intensifies. And as late as 1939, if you look at Spalding's street directories, which down in the Cambridgeshire collection in the City Library, and list the occupations of the head of household of all the streets, look at something like Great Eastern Street. And it is just one after another: LNER servant, LNER fireman, LNER engine driver, virtually everybody working on the railway, as indeed they continue to do, at least down to the 1960s. And list the occupations of the head of household of all the streets. Look at something like Great Eastern Street. And it is just one after another: LNER servant, LNER fireman, LNER engine driver, virtually everybody working on the railway, as indeed they continue to do, at least down to the 1960s. Virtually all of Romsey Town, though, built by private developers, private speculators. The Eastern Counties and the Great Eastern never had the money to build a lot of housing. A little bit was built at March, a little bit at Parkston Quay, a little bit at Stratford in East London. But in Cambridge, as far as I know, and I'm open to correction here, these are the only houses that the railway company actually built. These are from 1846, the houses, of course, which are down near the bridge. Very difficult to photograph now because trees have grown up and you can't really get all of them in shot. Bombed during the Second World War, and these were built for the superior officers of the company. The locomotive running superintendent, the goods agent, the assistant station master, and people like that. They're not built for the ordinary workers, who've got to sort of do the best they can in Great Eastern Street or wherever it may be. What the railway company does do is to provide at least some social facilities, and particularly the Great Eastern, a Conservative company, built the Conservative Club. And the memorial stone, which I photographed here, at great risk to life and limb. It's amazing, as soon as you start to sort of photograph things at ground level, the number of buggies that suddenly appear. And the foundation stone, or memorial stone, is laid by Lord Claude Hamilton, who was the chairman of the Great Eastern Railway, and actually had a class of locomotives named after him as well. And although it's interesting because we always think of Romsey as being radical, Red Romsey, Little Russia, called in the 1920s, 1930s. The Conservative influence is quite remarkable, because there's not just a Conservative club, there's also Earl of Beaconsfield, Disraeli, of course, a successful Tory Prime Minister of the 19th century, and there he is. I don't think you'd be all that flattered by the image that they put on the corner. And it's interesting, in fact, that it's not just Mill Road, Hills Road is exactly the same. And there's at the end of Hills Road Bridge, there is the Earl of Derby, who was Disraeli's predecessor as Tory Prime Minister. And I think you'd have to look quite hard in Cambridge to find a Liberal Prime Minister being commemorated, other than in things like Russell Street. So the Tories have got it all. And also, another facility for railway men, the railway mission. And the railway mission is one of these great Victorian enterprises. The Victorians were very keen on missions aimed at specific sections of the working class community. The mission to seamen is probably the best known because it continues today. The railway mission was an ecumenical venture, largely but not exclusively non-conformist. There were some Anglicans involved, and they put up mission halls for railway men wherever there was a sizable railway community. This is the Cambridge one in Devonshire Road, there was one in Ely, there was one in Norwich, and there was one in Bury St Edmunds, which is just outside the station and is well worth having a look at because it's a completely beautifully reserved tin tabernacle. And if you want to look at one of these prefabricated Victorian churches, it's a really good place. Well, where are all the railway men working? Well, most glamorously, or perhaps in the outside view, most glamorously, of course, they're on the footplate or they're in the locomotive sheds. This is Cambridge Loco Yard, again in 1911, looking northwards towards Mill Road Bridge, which is there. I suspect the photograph taken on a Sunday because of a number of engines that are standing in the yard. And here is the shed itself. For generations of small boys, engine sheds were the mecca. This is where you try to sort of sneak past the foreman with your notebook and well hidden, get around the shed quick, jot down all the numbers and get out again before you were discovered. Cambridge was unusual because you didn't need to do that. You could simply look over the wall from platform 6 and see everything that was going on. And here we have it around 1957, 58 or thereabouts. I suspect this train is from March behind the K3 there. And much later, towards the end of steam, this is probably around 1960. This is the view of the shed, station in the background. The typical selection of late steam, Great Eastern engine here at B12, either a B2 or a B17. There's an LMS engine, and over there, station there. And this, of course, is what is now the station car park. It's impossible to imagine from the station car park today what was going on here. It's equally interesting to know over here that you can see all the way to Ruskin Road, right over there. There is still some open space here, which is now, of course, all been redeveloped. Which again, some people will remember, it was a sort of graveyard of agricultural machinery for many years. Never quite discovered what it was all doing there, because it was. It's a very different view to what you have today. And one of the things that perhaps this photograph illustrates is although we tend to think of romance of steam, what we tend to forget is the sheer filth and hard work that went with steam locomotives. And it's not surprising that this part of the world was one of the first where steam was eliminated. Partly because of the expense of bringing coal. There had to be 2 coal trains a day just to keep Cambridge sheds supplied with coal. But because of the difficulty of recruiting people who were willing to work in these, as you can see, pretty appalling conditions, when you could get much more money and much cleaner work in working for Pye or Phillips or the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company or whoever it may be. And just a reminder, Cambridge did see big engines as distinct from the everyday ones. Working in from King's Cross, you would get the Crescent Pacifics, or in this case, Peppercorn Pacific and A1, usually working on filling in terms, as they were called. In other words, they worked up from the north, from Leeds, Newcastle, or wherever. They had some hours before going back home, and they would be used just to go to Cambridge and back on the Cambridge Buffet Expresses that ran every 2 hours. All swept away, loco sidings, a couple of loco sidings replaced them in the late 1960s, and today, of course, it is quite an event to actually see a locomotive at Cambridge as distinct from multiple units. And this is just an illustration of how quickly the railway scene can change in a very few years. Still working in the sheds, fully working on the freight side somewhere. Each of the companies has got its own freight depot. This is the Great Eastern, photograph from Hills Road Bridge. That's the old Great Northern engine shed over there. And again, there's the open countryside, and what appears to be a bit of agricultural machinery. The LMS got its own depot, the old London North Western, on the corner of Brooklands Avenue and Hills Road. This is Hills Road Bridge down there in the distance. And this was built in the 1920s, and of course has all been swept away. The Great Northern, its goods depot was in the angle between Station Road over here. Here are some of the Victorian villas, which have gone, of course, and Hills Road over here. Mainly coal here. Coal merchants, Vinters, Coote and Warren, Sharringtons, etc. all have their offices in this area. And that's the photograph, or an attempt at more or less the same angle today. I can't guarantee I got it right. But here you've got this development that looks as if it might be in some moderately run-down East European country. Another big icon in Cambridge. And here's the Midland goods depot. Devonshire Road over here in the background. All of this again, of course, completely swept away now. And commemorated until relatively recently in the Midland town, which was the pub in Cambridge Road. Industry, of course, also develops along the railway. And let's see what's my whistle. Starting really almost from the arrival of the railway, the industries which have been in the town or near the river moved to a railside location. Most notably Foster's Mills. Foster's, Millers, at Mill Pool very rapidly see the advantages of railway communication, start to move down to the railway in 1855, completed the move by 1890, and the consequence is, of course, the mills that dominated the skyline in this part of Cambridge right down to the 1980s, with sidings serving along the front. The Castle Market also moves to the railway. It's a typical Cambridge story. They talked about it for 30 years before they eventually got round to it. The market had originally been in the marketplace, moved up to the Northampton Street Pound Hill area in the 1840s, and in the 1880s finally moved down to the railway. I didn't unfortunately ever get a photograph of it when it was actually operating, but this is what remained by the late 1970s, which is basically just the entrance lodges and one or two other buildings. And in its latter years, perhaps best known for the bank holiday car boot sales, one of the great events in the Cambridge social calendar back in the 1970s, and now of course they're to a penny, but they really were quite big events in those days. And again, love the collection of classic cars, all very carefully parked, aren't they? So you look and that is the same view, but you can't take the same view nowadays because you'll be photographing the side of the Travelodge, but in front of the Travelodge or Sainsbury's, a very different view today. And there are the cattle pens round the back of the cattle market, where the cattle would be directly unloaded, driven round the corner, or brought back. And then looking north from the bridge, industrial Cambridge. The Cambridge the tourist would never see. And on each side of the line, as you look north from the bridge, a whole series of industrial establishments. Copperline works in the Victorian period, timber yards, builders' merchants, petrol depots, timber depots, etc. A very, very workaday scene. Rather different by the 1980s, as most of them had gone and started to go, and what had been basically freight in the 1960s, 1970s, and I took the earliest photograph. Once again, of course, now freight facilities have been swept away, carriage sidings, where freight had once been handled, and is again just a view down at rail level. Probably around about 1957, 1958, and the train probably from Ipswich coming in, and again there's one of the Cambridge shunters working there, and one of the many private sidings going up there. There were a whole series of them, particularly on the left-hand side of the line. And also there was the Foundry company, which the Eagle Foundry of 1848, which is there, or was there, behind what eventually became the Mill Road Library. This is really the only remaining bit of it. Headley's Foundry, originally in the town centre, burned down in 1848, moved down to the railway, and 2 years later, in 1851, to 1850 rather, built the only locomotive ever to be built in Cambridge, the Eagle, named obviously after their foundry. There's a saying in engineering, if it looks right, it is right. And I think I probably said enough for you to realise. It was built as a light branch line locomotive. It suffered from the fact it could only just move itself. It certainly couldn't pull a train. And eventually, it was converted into an inspection saloon. The directors and senior officers, and so they put this rather nice little carriage pit on the back. The driver will be standing actually out there, but the whoever is inspecting has got at least some cover. It didn't exactly cover itself in glory, it ran over the chief signal engineer somewhere around about Reedham in 1859, and seems to have been sort of sent up in disgrace after that. And nobody quite knows what happened to him, but perhaps somewhere there is lurking a bit of the evil that no one knows. And here another equally odd contraption. This is the gasworks shunt. The gasworks sidings were the last of the sidings on the left-hand side of the line, and quite extensive where the Beehive Centre is now, looking out towards Cullen's Lane in the background there. This is a Sentinel locomotive. Quite late, it wasn't built until about 1925, chain driven rather than connecting rods, and it has actually been preserved. I think it's still at Carnforth. The problem for the gasworks was always about that the sidings didn't actually reach to the gas plant. They're on the other side of Newmarket Road, and so the last bit always had to be done by a road. There was quite a fleet of steam lorries, I believe, in the 1930s, and possibly through to the post-war period, that were carrying the coal through. And finally, extractive industries. The brickmaking industry along Newmarket Road, which again, if you're standing on Mill Road Bridge, you really wouldn't be binoculars for this. But the brickmaking industry predates the railway, is encouraged by the railway, particularly because the railway is bringing in the coal to fire the kilns, but suffered from the 1880s onwards, from the development of the Peterborough brick industry, the fletting process, which was far cheaper than any other means of producing bricks. And so most of the Cambridge brickworks had gone out of production by 1914. This is the very last one. This is the Cambridge Brick Company. This is at Coral Park, the retail park, which I think didn't close down until 1940. And even having been closed down, the site wasn't really redeveloped until the late 1970s. And it left the chimney, and there was such a Cambridge landmark. This photograph, the story behind it, is that those of you who are my age, and indeed a lot younger than me, will remember the fact that when you bought Kodachrome or whatever, it was 36 exposures. But with a bit of luck, you could get 37. What's the question? What do you use the last one? Just photograph anything. And so I was on 37, I was at Coldham's Lane, and I just photographed the brickworks chimney, just to finish the film off and get away with processing. And luckily I did, because it was blown up the following weekend. I was excited that everything happened. I'm very glad I did. And finally, cement. A lot of cement making in East Cambridge. There was the works down Mill Road near Brookfields, the Isolation Hospital, the Saxon Cement Works, more or less where Sainsbury's is now, and then over towards Cherry Hinton, the Norman Works. Both the Saxon and the Norman were rail served. The last survivor was the Norman, and here are the sidings, Brookfield's signal box that controlled them, and here is the daily freight train from Cambridge to Bury, which always dropped the coal wagons in and totally empties away. Most of the, in fact, all of the cement by this time went out by road, and the works were actually quite extensively modernised after I took this photograph, and was, I'm told, basically kept going by contracts with the United States Air Force. And once those had dried up in the early 1980s, the writing was really on the wall for what was quite small works by contemporary standards. But this was just an everyday scene which has now disappeared. And just finally, one or two things that have disappeared, or not haven't disappeared, but have changed their usage. Closed stations. We've talked about Cambridge Station itself. There are others within the city boundaries. This is the first of them. This is Cherry Hinton Station, which was opened in 1851 and closed in 1854. Very short-lived. Largely because Cherry Hinton, which we think of as a Cambridge suburb, was purely an agricultural village. Population of, I think, 654 in 1851. There was no commuters, or very few, if any people in Cherry Hinton working in Cambridge, didn't make any money, and so closed, but became the crossing keeper's house. And it's very, very typical of the architecture of the Newmarket Railway, which was quite distinctive because virtually every building they put up, we've got these sort of raised gable ends like that. Full-board stations exactly the same, and we've got this thing on the end here, where presumably there had once been the station name. Second railway station, Barnwell Junction, which was an odd one in a way because it's only got platforms on the Mildenhall branch, which is going on here. The main line, which you can see, didn't have platforms at all. And just round the corner, perhaps the least known of Cambridge's stations, Fen Ditton Halt, which, as you can see, is not exactly over-provided with facilities. It was a very late arrival on the scene, not opened until December 1922. In the last week of the Great Eastern's independent existence. This is Ditton Lane, going over the top there. And because of this, the Mildenhall trains all carried retractable steps so that people could get in and out defended and other similar halts further along. And the third closed station was Chesterton, which again was opened in 1851. Somewhere in this area, it probably had platforms on both the main line and the St Ives link, which is going around there. Nobody knows, as far as we know, there are no illustrations on this. It doesn't even show very well on maps. And again, seems to have been closed around about 1855, 1856. It just disappears from the timetables, and no record of it being formally closed. But later, the whole area of here was developed, originally simply as a ballast tip. But from the 1950s, this became Chesterton Permanent Way Depot, which was one of the major civil engineers depots on the system. Particularly did all the welding, the long welded track that was then taken away from the weighing. Closed once again in the early 1980s, and a small forest of silver birch developed over the sidings, and then, of course, there's a remarkable resurrection as Cambridge North, and is, if one reads is true, may be followed quite shortly by Cambridge South, but we will see whether that does actually transpire. But it is quite a change from what was there only 2 or 3 years ago. And we must pause at that point. I'm sorry I overrun slightly, but I hope there's still time for you to enjoy the rest of the festival. So thank you very much for your attention.